So I don't know if you remember Ryan. Of course you do if you've been to SEVillage. You want to know how I know? Is because a couple years ago he gave a speech that I think like broke all sorts of weird DEFCON rules because it was really personal and not about hacking stuff, but his own brain. And it has so many stinking views that I can't tell you how many people come up and tell us that they're like coming to our class or something because of Ryan's speech, all about stepping out from being an introvert and into the world of SE. Well, now let's jump forward many years from the last time that the story in that speech took place, and we're going to hear an amazing story from Ryan today that's going to define what's the difference between SE teaming and red teaming. Ryan is the COO at Social Engineer LLC. We get to work together each and every day. He helps not only lead the projects and the work, but helps lead the team here at Social Engineer and helping them fulfill all of their tasks with the daily activities we do here at the company. So please sit back again, ask all your questions in Discord chat. I'll gather them, and at the end, when Ryan has Q&A time, we'll make sure all of your questions get answered. Ryan, welcome to the virtual stage, and I can't wait to hear the story, man.
Well, thanks. Very much appreciate that intro. That makes me feel bigger than I am, so that's thanks. All right, so here we're going to talk about just kind of a story of differences between what we at SECom define as SE teaming versus what kind of the industry defines as red teaming. So it's just kind of a perspective story. So as Chris said, I'm the COO of Social Engineer LLC. I have many other titles listed through that slide, as you can read. Volunteered Innocent Lives Foundation, Clutch Superfan, got to call that one out. And you'll notice I'm a PowerPoint default template user, so I don't put much thought into that, but hopefully the content will make up for that. So what we're going to talk about here is what's the difference between red teaming and SE teaming. So basically, what we define it as, SE teaming is during the day. We walk in the middle of the day, in the morning, towards the end of the business day, but we're talking to people, we're interacting, we're trying to get people to open doors for us, let us into places we're not supposed to be allowed. That kind of differs from the nighttime break-ins where you're picking locks or shimming your way in through different entrances. So we kind of define that, that's where our difference is. And so a red team is going to attack any hour of the day, nighttime, daytime, anything, and go any method that they'll use to gain access. An SE team, we're really focusing on the social engineering aspect of it. So we're trying to get people to want to help us get places where we're not supposed to be, right? So that's kind of what this story is going to be about. I'm going to tell an example of what we used as an SE teaming and then how red teaming could have differed from that and the extra steps we could have taken to make that leverage into what we would call a red teaming engagement. So just for a basis of this story, I need to point out that this did not take place on US soil. So we had to be extra careful about the laws that were in place and the people that we were talking to. And we needed to be conscious of those laws and the authorization we needed to do what we were expected to do when we were there. All of what we planned to do during this story was all proof of concept attacks. So we really took it right to that edge. We were kind of bridging the gap between what a lot of internal pen tests or ad sims do, where they assume someone has breached the network. We, with an SE team, we demonstrate that bridging of that gap where we walk in off the street and try to get access into the internal network. So some of the techniques are similar, but some of them are different. But again, this was all a proof of concept, so we weren't actually compromising the systems that we were touching during this engagement, but we were doing enough to prove that if we wanted to, we could have fully compromised those. So with every engagement that we do, we start with open source intelligence gathering. So this is no exception. So when we're going to infiltrate a building of some sort, of any client, of any company, we're going to do hours and hours of OSINT to try to build up as much information as we can to be able to build the pretext that we need to accomplish our goals. So the goals of this job that we needed to do is we needed to come off the street, walk into the building, and prove that we could actually access the internal network from there. And we did this against multiple buildings. So during OSINT, we needed to find out as much as we could about those locations. And what we did was we found a lot of information about the company that we were attacking, but we didn't find very much information about the locations themselves, like there weren't a whole lot of pictures of those locations. There wasn't a lot of information about how to access the buildings, but we found out a lot about the company culture, what the company does and how they do things, and the general employee base. We did a lot of investigation in that respect. So we found actually a lot of things for spear phishing attempts, for vishing attempts, but those weren't the goals of the engagement that we were doing. So while it was a lot of really useful information, we couldn't directly apply it to what our goal was, which was breaking into these buildings. Unfortunately, we found a number of pieces of information related to the vendors of this company, which is how we built our pretexts to be able to go on site. So what we did is we found that they were in the middle of a PCI assessment, or like their yearly PCI evaluation. And so through the OSINT that we found, we determined what the company was that our client company was using for their PCI auditors. So we took that and we used that for both building our pretext and coming up with building the frame around our pretext, meaning what we're going to look like, how we're going to present ourselves. And information about vendors can both be used for SE teaming and red teaming engagements. When we do either of those, vendor information is super important, because maybe we can leverage the vendor directly if they're in scope to kind of get into the client company, or at least we can emulate or impersonate the vendor to try to get into our client directly. So we use that to build our pretexts. We based our pretext around being a local compliance vendor for that area that was kind of partnering with the vendor that we found online. So we've created new shirts, we created business cards, we created badges that were all branded to this PCI auditor company, all based on images that we found online, and kind of just pieced all that stuff together. So now when we talk about scope, so we did a bunch of OSINT, we found a bunch of information about our client, but we also have to define a very strict scope for multiple reasons. One, it's a legal contract between you and the client. So it really, you have to be extra careful about what you put into the scoping documents, so no one falls outside of that line that could potentially turn into an illegal situation. Since we are going to be out of the US country and out of that jurisdiction, we really needed to pay very close attention to the scope that we were defining, and which defined which buildings we had the attack, which buildings we had permission to attack, and which buildings we explicitly did not have permission to attack. So for this particular client, when they first hired us, they asked us to go after a number of branches. This was a bank location in this remote country. They wanted us to go after a number of branches, and they wanted us to go after their network operations center, and they wanted us to hit their data center. So that was a lot to ask for in the time that Chris and I were actually going to be on site. So we traveled there, we were going to be there for a week. So we needed to get authorization letters for each of the buildings that we were going to try to access. And when in further conversation with our client was actually a pen testing client. It wasn't the bank themselves. So that really added a level of complexity to the scope that we hadn't done before. Usually we interact directly with the end client, like the client that we're actually attacking. And in this point, we had no contact with that particular client. Our client was a company that does penetration testing and adversary simulation in that locality, but they didn't have a whole lot of experience doing social engineering specifically. So they hired Chris and I to come down to their location and kind of teach them and teach their people how to do this work by example. They wanted us to actually do the attacks, but they also wanted us to include their members of their team in the process of building the pretexts and building the frame around those pretexts of what we look like, and then also potentially use their local resources as part of the attack. So that was kind of the scoping got a little weird when we started talking about the buildings that we were going to attack, because Chris and I are very adamant about getting authorization letters that explicitly define the buildings that we are going into, which shouldn't be that much of a surprise for anybody who does this type of work. But since the client that we are working with doesn't do this type of work, they were a little surprised that we wanted that explicit on our authorization letters. So in talking to them, ultimately, we got it down to we had explicit permission and signed written permission to access 2 bank locations and the NOC, but we didn't have access to the data center because it was a shared co-location, and we would have had to get access from the actual owner of the building, which was not a vendor in scope here. And so we were unable to gather one of those letters to get into the data center. So that was actually taken out of scope for this particular engagement. So when we broke it down after talking to them and telling them how we do our business, it came down to 2 different branches that we could hit, and then the network operations center was in scope. So that's what we had permission for. That's what we got our letters for. And so that's what we went forward doing. So one of the places that they had was called an administrative building. So it had a branch of the bank in it, but it was mostly an administrative building. So that was the first one that we went after. Now, because we're in a remote country, I need to make everybody just potentially a little uncomfortable here. So social engineering is not politically correct in any way. We leverage a lot of biases. We leverage a lot of cultural biases and gender biases and things like that to kind of not set people off when we're doing our work, because we don't want people critically thinking in the moment, or else we won't be successful. But the teaching moment comes where we leave them in a way that we can teach them how to see that situation differently and then be able to react better in that moment later on. So, for us, we want to win, but at the same time, we want the client to gain a teachable moment and be successful the next time we come back and try it again. So it's this, we're trying to always teach them to get better. So the place that we were at was not predominantly Caucasian. So if you've seen me, which you can now, and you saw Chris, who was on previously, we are very Caucasian. And so we stood out like sore thumbs in this location because there were not very many Caucasians outside of tourists in this particular location. So the places that we were going to do this work were not touristy locations. We were dressed in business casual. We were carrying our prerequisite of our clipboards and things like that. We were clearly not on vacation when we were there, was the point that I'm making. So we needed to really pay attention to that, because we didn't know how the local people there would react to us when we come walking into their building. We needed to be aware of that cultural difference, but we also needed to be able to leverage the cultural difference to our advantage in any way that we could. So we ended up using some of the local resources of our client to help us kind of get in the door in some places and kind of distract security guards and things like that, because it would be less of a red flag for the security guards in that location to deal with someone who is local than to deal with us. And we didn't walk in together with them, but we walked in at the same time. So they weren't really associated with us. So what we first did when we came up to that first building was we sent our local contact in to go in and just distract the guards that were in this location. And the guards that were there were just 2 guards behind a desk in a very typical building lobby. So we sent our local contact in. He started chatting them up a little bit. And then Chris and I got on our phones, sort of, and just looked like we were talking on the phone. And we walked in the front door and we immediately took a hard left, because we knew that there was a staircase there, because we had found some, a little bit more research showed us that there was some stairwells in that building. We didn't get like a whole building schematic, but we got some information about the local, like right inside the lobby there. So we knew that there was a stairwell right off to the side. And so when we walked in the building, without even making eye contact with the security guards, we walked in, we took a turn, and we just went up the stairs. And the security guards were so distracted by the local contact that we sent in that they didn't talk to us at all. So that was our initial first way in, our first in. So we spiral up the stairs and, we high five, hey, we're in. We walk into this main common area, and we see that there's a bunch of locked doors, there's badge access doors everywhere, but then there's this one area that doesn't have any locked doors, but it had a bunch of cubicles. And so we're walking around, we're fully dressed in our auditor stuff, and we're looking at our notes that we're taking as we're walking around. We walk into this public area, and we really didn't see anything of note there. And no one was really paying much attention to us, which was good, because that meant we were just kind of blending in and not really raising any red flags. And so we poked around the public area a little bit, and then we turned around and we came back into the main hallway, and we saw this woman walking towards one of these locked doors that we found. And she walked in, and we tried to tailgate her as quickly as we could, but we got there a little too late. The door just kind of shut on us. And so we just knocked gently on the door, and she opened it because she was right on the other side. And then we just walked right in right after her after that point. And the label on the door said ATM testing. So we were like, okay, this should be an interesting moment for us to try to find something interesting. So we walked in, and Chris gave the pretext to the 2 people that were in the room that we were PCI auditors, and we're just there to check some stuff out. We had this big long roll of stickers that just said, they're red stickers, big red stickers that just said approved on them. That's all that it said on it. And I was holding the roll of stickers. And Chris is just like was pointing out and saying, all right, we're just auditors. We're here for a PCI audit. And they just kind of shook their head. And we said, we know that you're under an audit right now. So we're here doing an initial run. We're just here to check out some speed tests on some computers and see if everything is good for PCI. And I've had some experience in my life being a pen tester for a PCI auditing company, but we were definitely not auditors if you knew anything about PCI, but these people clearly didn't know that much about it. And so they just kind of shook their heads and let us do our thing. And so I went around and I was actually sticking approved stickers on like wall jacks and on mice and up on monitors and things. And we were just like, yep, that's approved. Yep, that's approved. And we saw that they had these ATMs that were listed there, and some of them were open and they had active testing happening. And so Chris was kind of distracting the two people that were in the room, and I walked around and I crawled almost entirely up inside an ATM snapping pictures, just trying to show how far we can get. So we took pictures of all the inside of the ATMs so we could take that back. And then we walked around and, I was sticking approved stickers everywhere. Must have left like 15 in this tiny little room. It was actually pretty funny. But so, once we figured out that we weren't going to get on a particular computer there because there was really no terminals that were of use for us in that moment, we thanked the people for their help, and they just kind of shook their heads and waved us off, and we left. And we walked outside back into that main hall, and down at the end of the hall were these clear glass doors that were badge access only. And so we walked down to that, and we just stood outside the door, just very patiently waiting for someone to come out of that door, because we weren't able to, there was no one directly at the door, so we would have knocked, but no one was around. And finally, this woman came walking towards the door, and we opened the door like gentlemen and held the door for her. Once she walked in front of the IR and opened the lock, we opened the door for her, and she walked out and thanked us, and we just walked right in. And we were around this area around the holiday time where they had stuff hanging from the ceiling. And Chris is pretty tall, and so the ceilings in this particular location were fairly short. And so when we walked in, we were just so happy that we got through this locked door that Chris walks face first right into one of these hanging trees that was hanging from the thing, and everything around him just started shaking and making tons of noise. And everybody we walked into, it was a call center ultimately that we walked into, and everybody looked up like prairie dogs and kind of looked around and saw the two of us standing there with these things swinging near Chris's head. And he was just like, oh no, the crazy Americans wrecking the holidays. And everybody just kind of chuckled for a minute, and then they just went back down and kept typing. And so we definitely distracted everybody for a second, but since clearly blending in. So we made a huge fuss about that, but then all of a sudden we cleared it up pretty easily, and we just walked over, and we were trying to find empty terminals where we could sit down and try potentially compromising some computers. That was our goal for getting into this particular part of the area. And so once all the ringing stopped and everyone was back to work, we just casually walked around without anybody really interacting with us at this time. And we found this one workstation that was sitting there, and it was locked, and this woman was sitting next to it. And I walked up to the terminal, I sat down, and I just kind of hit enter a couple times, and it wasn't like an auto login scenario or anything, and it popped up a login. And so we just turned to the woman next to us and said, hey, would you mind logging into this terminal for us 1 second? And she was just like, who, me? And we were like, yeah, absolutely. Just, we're just here for PCI auditing. We just need to run a couple tests. If you could just log in here for us, that would be really appreciated. And meanwhile, we're videotaping everything that we're doing. We have like cell phone cameras in our pockets, and we have clipboard cameras and things like that. So we're recording all of this for evidence of what's going on. So when we go back to our client, we present them with this big video file, and they can see what was happening. And so when we asked this woman to go log in, she like took her headset off and looked around for a minute, and then kind of scooted over to the next desk, and she started typing, and Chris put his cell phone up right over her to record, and we recorded her typing every character of her password. We looked at it later, and we actually saw that we actually picked out every single character of her password on this video. So we compromised her account, kind of just asking her to do it. And she was very happy to help us, and we logged in, and I sat down and I just went to speedtest.net. I was just like, yep, we're just here for PCI auditing. I went to speedtest.net, and then I took out my USB key. That was our kind of our pseudo malicious USB key, where it just kind of pings back to a server that we own to show that we inserted it and it did something. So it didn't really compromise the system, but this was all a proof of concept. So I was running speed tests. So if anybody walked by, they saw that I was doing something, and I stuck the USB key in, and I watched it kind of go through its motions. It popped up its little screen that said, yep, I contacted the server. And I pulled that out. So that was officially, according to our proof of concept, we compromised one system. And at the same time, we compromised a set of credentials. So that was really useful for us as part of the reporting process where we could go through and do this. And so we had lots of time to kind of walk around. And so once we were finishing up with that particular terminal, I saw that there was a person behind us that had just stood up from their desk and they walked off and they left their computer unlocked. And so I immediately just stood up and I spun around and I walked across and I saw they had their badge lying on their desk, their RFID badge lying on their desk, and their computer was unlocked. So we took a couple pictures of that badge and then sat down and did the same thing. We were doing speed tests stuck in the USB key, but this time a manager walked up and started questioning us and asking us what we were doing. And so we gave her the story of being PCI auditors, and she kind of looked at us a little weird, and we said we were just doing spot checks of different computers to check speed tests for the PCI audit, and we needed to get something off the USB key as part of the test. And she looked at us a little weird and then walked away. And we thought we were in the clear. So we kept doing it, and we did that computer, and then we spun around and we went to a third computer. And when we were sitting at the third computer that was left unlocked, she came back with another person. And so we gave the same story that we were PCI auditors. We were only there for a short period of time, and that we were just trying to finish this up. And she asked us who our contact was. Well, we didn't have a name to drop as part of this pretext. So we just said, our manager just sent us here. We can call our manager if you want us to, but we're just here for 24, 48 hours, not really here very long doing a test. And we're from the States, and they sent us here to quickly do this test. So she kind of questioned us a little bit and asked us a little bit more about who we were working with and who we were working for. And we told her a little bit more about the company that we were trying to impersonate. And then she walked away again. And so we just kept typing and kept hacking away. And then all of a sudden she came back again and she's like, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. And we were like, oh, okay, that's fine, fair. And so we got up and we walked back, and she walked us all the way back down to the security desk that we had walked by in the beginning. So now we're back to the two guys. Our local contact is long gone. And so now we're faced with talking to security about what we're doing. So she felt like she had done everything that she could do to potentially stop some suspicious people. So she felt satisfied that we were at security and felt security could handle it at this point. So she left. And so Chris and I are sitting there, and we gave the two guards the story of us being PCI auditors, everything that I've already said. And they asked us again who our contact was. And I mentioned that we could make a phone call out to our manager if you wanted. And they said, okay, I guess that will work. And so Chris dialed up our real client as to impersonate our manager of the company we were impersonating. And so kind of gets a little meta. But so we just called basically a random person and handed the phone to the security guard. And the random person on the other end of the phone was impersonating our manager. And so they had a very brief conversation about what was happening. We heard the security guard side of the conversation. So he was asking who we were, what we were there for. The person on the other end of the phone was confirming everything that we were saying and doing. So the security guard felt pretty satisfied with what was going to happen. And so he handed our phone back. He's like, okay, guys, you're all set. And we were just about to walk back to where we were going to go, and we saw another person come down and start to interact with us. Well, it turns out the person that just came down was actually the point of contact for our client's client. So it was the point of contact in the bank for the company that hired us. And she knew what we were there for, but didn't know us personally. And so when she came down, because someone had told her that there were some weird gentlemen walking around and doing stuff to computers, she immediately thought, oh, this must be part of the test. So she came down just as we were about to exit the lobby and confronted us and said, hey, are you here about this thing? And so we were like, can we talk to you outside quick, if that's okay? And so we went outside the building as to not talk to the security guards. And we told her everything that was going on. Okay, this is everything we did. We got into the HEM room, we got into the call center, and she was like, oh, that's amazing. That's great. That's great news. You can go and keep going if you want. And we're like, well, now that you've kind of outed us in front of the security guards, we really don't have the ability to maintain our pretext anymore. And she was a little distressed at that, but she understood where we were coming from. And so we couldn't really perform at that location anymore. But ultimately that situation kind of told us that we could have compromised multiple computers. We definitely could have done stuff to ATMs or at least gained more information about the ATMs, which was all information that was really helpful for the bank client to understand that level of access with just two guys walking off the street could get into this level of access. So that ended up being a really beneficial moment for them when we finally did this. So the next bit that we wanted to do was to go to their network operations center, which was also next to one of their bank branches. So we waited till the next day to do that because we already felt like we'd caused enough ruckus that particular day. So we went to the NOC the next day. Now we had to, from where we were staying in our hotel, we had to drive it. I don't know, it felt like 8 hours worth of time, but it was probably like 2 hours, but it felt like forever. We were driving so far out of the touristy areas of this location that I've never been anywhere even close to something like this, where it was like the most native parts of this particular location. We were driving by restaurants that were just like cooking food in the dirt. And, lots of locals were looking at us weird because people don't vacation in these locations of this particular country. So it was very weird to see us there. And we just kept driving and driving and driving. And finally we got to this location that had the NOC. And Chris and I kind of sat in a parking lot across the street from the location to kind of just scope it out for a couple hours. And so we noticed all the things that were going on in the area. Like the NOC was surrounded by this giant fence that had razor wire around it, and they had guard posts at every corner of the parking lot, and they had guys on dirt bikes that were riding around that had guns hanging off of their dirt bikes, and they were dressed in full body armor. It was a crazy sight. I'd never, like, they had like the teeth on their masks, like they looked super aggressive, and they had like shotguns hanging off of their waists as they were on these dirt bikes, just patrolling the parking lot of the location. So I look over at Chris and I'm like, hey, are we going to do this? And he's like, it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Which, if you know anything about Chris, that's a very common statement that he makes when we're in like the throes of danger. It's just going to be, don't worry, it'll be fine. So take a deep breath and we'll figure it out. And so we end up, figuring out what angle we're going to take to try to get in, because our main goal was the NOC area, which had the razor wire around it and the guards outside. And the branch was kind of a secondary target for that location. So we walked up to the razor wire and we kind of knocked on the fence, and this guy came out of the building. So if you can imagine this, it was like a solid brick building that had no windows on it. And then it had maybe 8 to 10 feet off the brick was the razor wire. So it was a very self-enclosed area, and then it had these big gates on it. So we knock on the gate to try to see if anybody's going to even come and look at us. And we see this head pop out. The door itself was the only place that had a little window. We see a head pop out of the window, and he comes walking out, and he comes down and he starts asking like what we want. And so we give him the whole story about being PCI auditors, and he didn't really know what to make of it. And he was asking us, he had a very specific protocol he needed to follow to let people in. So after we gave him the story, he was like, all right, you wait here. And he walked inside and he made a few phone calls. And then as we would naturally expect, none of our story checked out at all. So when he came back out, he's like, yeah, I got nothing on you guys. But we can do some other verification if whoever I'm calling doesn't have the information that they need. So, we appealed to him because we were out in the blazing sun. It was actually quite hot where we were. And we asked for a little bit of sympathy and some compassion and say, can we at least come inside so we're not in the blazing sun? This is our first time in this location. We were not told it's going to be like this. We dressed so inappropriately for the heat. Can you please just let us into the building so we can, while you're checking us out, and figure that out? And he was like, oh yeah, sure, great. And he opened up the razor wire locked gate and escorted us into the NOC area so he could continue verifications. So what that allowed us to do was start taking video of the inside of the location. What we learned was that there's this sort of waiting area inside this building, and then there's another locked door that goes into the NOC where all the computers actually are. So we're waiting in this waiting area, and he's like, you just wait here a second. And when he started to walk away, we noticed there are some kind of guest computers sitting there. And so I made 2 steps over with my USB key to go to one of these guest computers. And all of a sudden, and this is going to sound like an exaggeration, but it's not an exaggeration. This giant individual that just like stepped out in front of the doorway. His head was over the top of the doorway. He was enormous. And, he had billy clubs hanging off, and he had, knives and stuff across, and he was ready for combat is what it looked like. And he just stood there, and he was this gigantic man, and he just crossed his arms. And when I took one step towards the computer to go put my USB key in, he just looked at us and went, And Chris kind of like grabbed my shoulder and pulled back a little bit. And I was like, all right, hands off. I won't touch anything. And he stood there, stand guard, and just, he wouldn't say a word to us. He just grunted at us. It was such a surreal experience to feel like you're going to die in that moment. But if you made any move in the wrong direction. So finally, the original guard came back, and he's like, okay, so I couldn't check out any of your story. I called all these people, and we were like, oh, well, who did you call? And so he started listing off all these names of people that he was calling, and we were writing them all down, trying to figure out, all right, from this instance, we're trying to pick out what is the access requirements for this building. So we got all kinds of names, and he told us the entire process it's going to take to get into this building. You got to send an email to this person. This person gets you on the list. Then you got to do this. Then you got to do that. And we're writing all this stuff down. And then he basically said, all right, well, once you get some authorization, then you can come back. And we were like, okay, that's fine. So we exited the building. We went back. We had our points of contact waiting in a local car. We brought all the information back, and we went back to the headquarters, so where we were kind of planning out everything. From that information that we got from that guard, we actually started formulating spear phishing attacks against all the people that were named. We started making phone calls to people. We actually initiated the entire process to get access. And we felt like we had everything in place for the next day to show up and try to get into this building. So we formulated a plan, we figured everything out, and we sent all these emails and phone calls. And we were getting the client that hired us to do a lot of the phone calls for us, as well as we used their infrastructure to send all the emails. So they got the most experience out of doing this for themselves, because this wasn't really something that they were used to. So, we schemed overnight to try to figure out how we were going to get into this knock the next day. And we made the whole drive back, the 12, 15 hours it took to get back to that place. And we get to the same location, and we feel like we have everything in place. We got some confirmations via some of our phishing emails. We talked to people on the phone, and they seemed like they were going to do what we asked them to do. So we went up to the same building. We knocked on the door. The same guard from the previous day came walking out, and he was like, hey, it's you guys again. We're like, hey, how you doing? So he just immediately opened the door for us without us having to say any more of our story. And we walked into the building again. And he's like, hey, so I received that email about you getting on the list. So he's like, all right, so we did something good. And so, Chris and I are pretty happy about that. And he's like, now where's your escort? We were like, our what? He's like, yeah, so, now that you're on the list, now you need an escort from the bank that can get you into the knock. We're like, all right, you didn't tell us about that yesterday. He's like, oh, yeah, you need an escort, by the way. We're like, okay, fine. So we were like, we'll go get an escort. We'll be back in just a few minutes. And he's like, you're going to need these. And he handed us 2 guest badges. And so now we have 2 badges that he let us walk out of the facility with, and which we could, we have opportunities here for lots of more red team-esque moments for this. And I'll get to that kind of towards the end of this. But so now we have 2 guest badges, and we walk back to our point of contact, and we're like, hey, you're going to impersonate this guy, and you're going to be our escort in. So he's like, okay, that's fine. And so we come walking back. He's like, hey, this is the guy that you're asking for. He's our escort. And the guard was again like, okay, great. And he let us all in, and we walked over to the access point to get into the knock. And he's like, let me see your badge. And so we had a kind of a fake badge made up just to kind of look the same. And we handed it to him, and he looked at it for a second, and then he put it against the RFID, and nothing happened. And he's just like, your badge doesn't seem to be working. And we're like, oh, well, that's pretty weird. Well, I mean, you're here. Can you open the door for us? And he's like, I don't have access to the knock. And so this really pointed out a very specific point of this process of trying to get into this knock, is that the security guards themselves don't have access into the knock, but they need people from other parts of the business to be able to open certain doors. And so this gave us a huge insight into their process. And we know that this guard is trying to follow the process as close as he could, but this guy would have done anything for Chris and I at this point, because he was totally bought into our pretext. So that didn't quite work, but we couldn't badge in at that point. And we said, well, how do we get a valid badge? So we need to go talk to get this badge redone. Can we get our own badges to get in here? And he gave us the whole process of trying to procure badges to get into the knock. And so we were writing all of these notes down about how to do this. And then as we were leaving, we're like, hey, can we just get a tour of the facility? Who do we talk to about getting a tour of the facility? That's all we really need. We just got to see stuff's in racks. We just got to put these approved stickers on things. Like, we don't need to actually touch anything. We're just trying to look. And he's like, okay, well, here's the contact to get the tour going, and here's the information you're going to have to supply to them. And so we gathered all this information, and then we left that location, and we were starting to run out of days of actually being on site. We were only supposed to be there for 5 days, and this was already kind of the 4th day that we were there. And so we knew that we weren't going to be able to make another attack on the knock, but we at least gathered enough information and kind of taught our client that was paying us what they needed to do to continue this attack. And so we figured out all this information. It turned out to be pretty helpful for our client. So this brings me to what were the wins and what were the failures of the bank itself. So there were a few things going on. At the admin building, they had a failure of the employees not being empowered to ask questions. And that was one thing that we brought up in the report itself, was that, we're speaking of like the woman who gave us her credentials by just asking, or the person who let us into the ATM room. None of them felt that empowered to actually ask us questions about what we were doing, or to stop us from doing it. We only found one person, and that was kind of the win for them, which was their manager that followed their protocol and escorted us down to security because we were unverified. And so that was a huge win for the client. The only part of that was that she left us there. And so she left us at the security desk without staying and watching the security desk either escort us out or properly verify us. So she just kind of said, I did my part, and then she left, which she did. She did an amazing job. The second failure for that location was the security guards themselves, is that they didn't verify us at all, and they took the word of a random person on the phone to say that we were supposed to be in that building. And so that was a great learning moment for their security guards, where they need to have a more strict adherence to their policies about admitting unverified people. So that was kind of a 1 win, 2 fails for the admin building. And that the information we provided the client turned out to be really helpful for their training, kind of help employees feel more empowered, help the security guards feel not only empowered to do things, but also understand their policy more. So I guess the security guards were outsourced, where they didn't actually work for the bank. They were a hired security company. And so that allowed the bank to properly vet their security guards a little bit more with the contracting company to show them what their policies were more appropriately. The network operations center kind of was semi the opposite of that, where they had 2 wins and 1 failure from our perspective. One of the wins was that the guard that was there local, was following his procedure to a T, and he did not deviate from that. So he wasn't letting us into places that we weren't supposed to, with one exception, but he didn't really let us get anywhere. So that was really good from him. He really tried to enforce it. The problem was that he allowed us into that initial part of the building without verification, and he told us everything we needed to do to get verified. I don't necessarily think that was his job function necessarily. If we were legitimate auditors, we would have had a point of contact somewhere within the building to tell us what that process was. But he was kind of on our side so much that he really wanted to just help us. He was feeling pretty compassionate, and that we were just lost and we didn't know what we were talking about, and we kind of employed a lot of ego suspension to kind of say, like, we're just dumb Americans. We're here for a job. Can you just help us? We don't know what we're doing. And so he provided us a ton of information of how to get into the building that we were trying to get into. Now, if we were there for 2 weeks, maybe we could have made another attack on that and pushed that a little bit further, but our engagement was only a week. So we had enough information to try again, and we kind of left that up to our client to attempt that again. The third was that the guards, again, followed protocol perfectly and didn't allow us to even touch anything within that location. So yes, they allowed us into this building that was secured, but they didn't allow us to touch anything. And they were clearly prepared to take action if someone did something out of line. The guys that were circling the parking lot on their motorbikes, and the giants that they employ inside the buildings were clearly ready to defend the location. That was very clear to us from the very beginning. So they have that down. It was just the small mistakes of giving up too much of the process was there, and then just not fully verifying us with giving us access to things, because we video recorded the inside of what we saw, And that just showed us what we could prepare for next time. So that was kind of the client wins and client failures that we put into the report itself. Now, what would I do if we were doing a red team engagement with this same scenario? So we were SE teaming. So we were doing a proof of concept and trying to show that we could bridge that gap. Now, if we were tasked to actually bridge that gap, there were a lot of things that could have happened. So we could have actually used real malicious USBs to compromise the 3+ systems that we were engaged with. So that was a very obvious one. We could have used Dropboxes where when we were getting access and I was putting approved stickers on network jacks, I could have been plugging stuff in instead and leaving those for external access. That's something that we've done in the past. That's something we very well could have done in this scenario. That wasn't in scope for this particular job. So, and then aside from that, we could have cloned badges that we found. Like we found that one badge in the admin building. We could have cloned that to replicate that and use it somewhere else. And we could have actually accessed stuff at night. We don't know what the protocol was for nighttime access. I would assume that there was still security guards around the NOC, but we don't know what their shifts were like. We could have watched a little bit further and trying to potentially get over the fence or under the fence, or go after some part of the branch that was next to the NOC to prepare for a daytime entry the next day. So there was a lot of elements that we could have done if it were a red team engagement, which would have pushed that and made it less of a proof of concept and more of an actual compromise. But since this was just a proof of concept test, we pushed that boundary right up until the edge. And then we stopped there to say that this is how far we could have gotten. And if we went any further, then we would have actually needed to compromise things. So the differences between the SE and the red team are, there's a lot of commonality between the two types of attacks. It's just when we do an SE team, we're trying to get the people to do all the work for us, as opposed to us going in and manipulating things all by ourselves, like picking locks or trying to get through access barriers. I would rather have someone open the door for me than me have to shim the door or to pick the lock itself. So that's kind of why we gravitate more towards SE teaming. But with the red teaming bits, we can do all that, and we have done all of that. It's just there are different ways to approach the two attacks that draw a very distinctive line between the two to show that they're both valuable tests, but they're both independent tests from each other. They can be combined, which sometimes we do combine them, but they are approached very differently, and you have to have a very different perspective on how you approach those differences. So that's my story. I really hope you enjoyed or got a couple laughs out of that story, but I'm ready for any questions that anybody has. I can go into more detail maybe about some of those issues if you have questions on it. But I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who came and saw this, and feel free to contact me on any of those contact methods. And just thanks again.
Ryan, that was awesome, man. And I got to just verify one thing for everyone who's asking. 0% exaggeration. That's not Ryan's style. If it was me, you may be able to say it, but 0%. Okay, you have a number of questions. Probably the most important one. Yeah. Were you hired based on your love for Clutch?
I'm going to say that contributed to it. I want to say it contributed to it. I want to say it contributes to most everything in my life, is that my love for Clutch just pushes me forward. But I think they also liked the fact that we specialize in social engineering, and that was something that they were deficient in. And so we were there really to train that particular company on how to do what we do, but we were doing it on behalf of them for one of their clients. So that was kind of an interesting situation.
I can go with that answer. I can go with that. Okay, this one. Did you play up local stereotypes that they have for your ethnicity, body, or look, or did you try to be hidden and blend in?
Well, I think naturally we tried to be hidden and blend in because that's kind of more of our style. Unfortunately, I think the natural ethnic biases came into play without us being prepared for that. So yes, I think both of those came into play. And when someone said, when we walked in and they didn't question us based on how we looked, we took that as, oh, we're blending in. But then our contact kind of told us, well, they're probably just doing that because they don't want any conflict with you. We're like, all right, we'll take that too, I guess, if that's what the job entails. But our idea at the beginning was to blend in. I think what we looked like kind of made us stand out a little bit more than we wanted to.
Yeah, I would agree. As someone said, and hey, Ryan is still alive. Win. I agree.
Hey, yeah.
Okay.
Did not die that time.
Yeah, not that time.
Not yet.
Okay. Next question. How common is now? This is when you were telling the story about the woman coming down and kind of calling us out.
Okay.
So the question is, how common is it for clients to quote unquote cheat like that and cause the test to be cut short?
How common is it?
Yeah.
For me personally, that had never happened to me. So I'm going to say it's uncommon because I had never had someone do that. We were actually caught off guard by that because she just openly started talking about the engagement in front of the security guards. And so that's when we were like, hey, why don't you just shut up for a second and come out the door? And so we kind of ushered her out of the building to continue the conversation. And at that point, we already knew that we were burned with the security guards. So walking back in really wasn't worth the test. It was kind of done at that point. So for me, it was very uncommon. And usually, and I think it happened because we were 2 degrees away from the client. So she had never met us. So she just knew that these 2 strange individuals were walking around doing all this strange stuff in the building. And she's like, it must be that test that I hired. And when she walked down and she looked at us, I don't know, confirm for me, Chris, she looked a little shocked that we were the 2 standing there.
Yeah. I think she was expecting someone of a different skin color.
Yeah.
When
it was us, she approached it very emotionally by like, oh, so you're the 2 guys from that thing. And we're like, shh, don't say that. And so, that's why we ushered her out. So yeah, for me, that was very, very uncommon. And it was kind of a bummer because I thought we were going to just take over that whole building if we had the opportunity, because we had the guards in our pocket at that point. I mean, they took the phone call and they're like, you guys are cool. See you later. And then she ruined it. But it's going to happen. I'm sure it's not going to be the last time it's going to happen, but that had been a first for me.
I love it when the guards were like, so where do you need to go now? Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
You're approved. Where do you want to go? It's like, thank you.
Yeah.
So before I go to the next question, there was one about this, and it was having her disclose the test. Would you consider that a fail on their part?
I would not consider that a fail in the sense because she knew about it and she was our point of contact. So we kind of have to have some leeway for our points of contact because we're not testing our points of contact. They already know about it. So she failed herself and ruined the test. So she kind of wasted money in that sense. So if you're someone in accounting, you're going to say that she failed, absolutely, because they didn't get a complete test at that location. But from our sense, I don't think she failed because that was a community. She was trying to talk to us kind of out of bounds, right? Yeah. She was trying to have a conversation about the test, which is something that we would never do on location. So, and we weren't testing her, so she wasn't really failing. But the security guards failed and the person who gave up their credentials failed. But the person who brought us to the security desk definitely passed, I think, if we're doing a pass-fail of the testing.
I mean, by then we had owned the security guards like 2 ATMs and 3 computers. So, getting any more was just for fun. It wasn't really, right?
Yeah, we could have tested other parts of the building and done a more thorough test of the user base, which is kind of what we were there for. But she kind of ruined that because now the security guards would be in on it. So if anybody called security, they'd be like, oh, it's just those 2 guys. That's not really a fair test.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the next one. Other than ensuring that legal was squared away, what other considerations did you have for a foreign country, i.e. language support, legal support, especially breaching a heavily guarded location?
Yeah, so I'm not a lawyer by any sense. So I have to rely on our lawyer and our client's lawyers constructing a contract that's not going to get us arrested. Now, as part of our OSINT, we found the jails that were apparent in this location, and we were like, we don't want to go anywhere near those jails. And our point of contact when he was driving us back from the airport was like, and that's where you might go later this week. And we're like, it's just like this barren, like 19-foot concrete wall with razor wire. We're like, nah, I really don't want to go there. So it's really up to you when you're scoping the engagement to make sure that all of that legal stuff is in place. So your company has to have a lawyer that can understand the international part of the engagement, or at least the contract with the company you're contracting with to know that they have authority. So like that really comes back to the scoping part of the discussion where they said go after the data center, and we said, well, where's our authorization for the data center? And they said, well, we couldn't get one from the owner of the building, and said, then we're not accessing that building because we're only going to do things that we know that we have written permission to do that for, and that we have at least an idea that we're legal to go there. Now, if those contracts that we were signing and they were signing weren't valid, that's a whole other issue that we weren't able to get into, that we really asked about numerous times. So they knew it was a hot button issue for us, because we did not want to go to these international jails, because our lawyer said, well, I can make phone calls, but I don't have jurisdiction to come and get you in those locations. So we were really reliant on the people hiring us. And so since it was effectively we were being hired by a third party, we had to ensure that they had the authority to do this stuff. And we really pushed that pretty hard with them. We had a couple of meetings with them where we need to be sure that we have legal authority to go into these places, and that the bank that we're hiring owns these buildings. Because we made a distinct point that if the bank doesn't own the building, then we need permission from the owner of the building to get into it. And I think that was new to them. They had never done this type of work before, so they never knew we'd go to that depth. So
that's a good point and a good answer. I think that will help a lot of people who are asking that. Do you feel that being foreign helped you with your pretexting for this engagement?
Ultimately, I think it did. I think being a native would have been helpful for kind of talking people up and kind of becoming friendly with them. But us being foreign, I think gave us an air of authority that I don't think we could have made up. I think that came with just the culture of the place that we were in that made that happen, where we came walking in, and anything that we asked for from pretty much anybody, they were very willing to give us answers or give us access, except for the couple of managers that we talked to that knew that there was some protocol, and they felt empowered enough to stand up to us, but none of the employees seemed to feel empowered enough, which was one of the major points that we made in the report that we gave, was that they really need to push the empowerment of the employees to be able to stand up to visitors.
Yeah. Did the location have a history of serious attacks, and that's why they needed armed response?
I never got that background. I was actually pretty surprised when we came up to the knock and saw that level of armament. Like, they had full body armor and on these dirt bikes with the guns hanging out. Like, that is no exaggeration. I wish we had, we could show pictures of that, but we can't. But I wish we could, just to prove it, because one of the guys had like the monster teeth on his mask. Like, he's so aggressive looking. But I think it might have been the area the bank existed in that warranted that level, because it wasn't the country that we were in was not a Western country. So they had pretty seedy elements around the area that our points of contact were telling us about. So I would assume that level of access, because it's the knock of this large bank in this country, that they felt like they needed to have some level of access. But we never got told about any attacks specifically that happened on it. But I can't imagine they would put that level up without some type of threat they knew about.
Yeah. Here's one that is great for you. It's a new question, just came up. So this person is asking because they are an introvert. How do you navigate your natural instincts to shut down? I'm asking because I'm an introvert myself, and in many situations that you mentioned, I would just leave or abort the mission.
Yeah. Well, believe me, those thoughts went through my mind. I fully assure you of that. So this kind of gets away from this particular story and kind of gets more into my first speech, which was everything that it took to overcome my introvertedness to become a social engineer in general. So, in that aspect, that path actually affected multiple parts of my life, not just being a social engineer, but it was the goal of becoming a successful social engineer that drove me to try to overcome this stuff. And it was, I put myself in a lot of very uncomfortable situations on purpose to kind of get used to that feeling of being uncomfortable. It's a common phrase I've heard a lot, is being comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Being able to survive in that moment is where it really comes from, because then the opportunity arises for you to take steps that you would normally talk yourself out of. So I've done a number of these type of SE team engagements, and it seems to always come up with banks. But one of the first ones that I did, I went and sat in front of the bank branch, and I just sat in my car, like sweating through my shirt, and just tried to play music for me that calms me down, so I could kind of bring that anxiety down for a few minutes. And then once I brought that down, I was able to kind of I kind of call it just like it's like my business face is what I actually really call it. It's where I just turn off my worry for a few minutes. And once I get into that moment, I just act. And it's not like a mindless acting. It's a worryless acting. I can't be afraid of what I'm about to do, or else I wouldn't do it. And so I take this moment of kind of get myself, do some breathing exercises. For me, it's meditation, but I get myself into some breathing exercises, and then I calm the worry down just enough. Like, it never goes away, but I calm it down just enough to say, all right. And then I step out my door and I start walking. And from that point on, I know I have to just keep acting, or else it's all going to fall apart. And so I go through, I do the job, and then I come back and I sit back in my car, and then the anxiety just washes over me again. And I'm safe in my car, and I'm closed up in my car. I lock my doors and I turn my music back on, and I just sit there and I feel that anxiety. That's one important part, is if you don't feel it, you'll never get used to it. So you really have to feel it to understand it. And then you can start to it never goes away, but you can work with it. And I think being able to work with it is how I personally overcome it. And, it might not really appear like I'm an introvert, especially since I'm all gesturing and I'm talking and I'm doing all this stuff, but this is all a performance. Like, after I'm done here, I'm going to go lie down on my couch and just decompress, because it takes a lot out of me to do stuff like this. But I still find it gratifying to go do it.
So a couple of things, just because Ryan sucks at self-promotion. If you go to YouTube and you type in Ryan MacDougall, so his name, and the word introvert, you'll find a DEFCON speech from, I believe it's 3 or 4 years ago, where he tells a very intimate story of his journey from a serious introvert to now leading the team here that does all these things. So Ninja, you're asking, you should definitely go watch that speech. That is a wonderful explanation to answer your question. And then someone else commented that this guy takes the do things that scare you to the max. And that is true. Yeah. Okay. Last question that we have, and this is probably the most important one of the night, is that if this person memorizes all Clutch song lyrics, would that help them interviewing for a job for us?
I can't say it would hurt.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely a leg up. Definitely.
Yeah. I have to agree with that assessment. I think it is a leg up. So, Ryan, that was amazing, man. And the way you told, I was sitting there going, wait, I don't remember that part. The part that we went back after, I was like, whoa, I completely forgot about that. And and it was so awesome to relive that and to go like, oh man, so many times I've almost got this guy killed. Like, it just makes me feel guilty. And I literally LOL'd. Like, I laughed out loud when you told the story of me face planting into that giant Christmas globe.
Oh, that was brilliant.
I forgot about that. And I was just like, bam. And I'm like, oh, Americans ruining the holidays. Everyone laughed.
Yeah,
Talk about awesome. Yeah, that is good. Great job, man. Great job. Thanks for doing that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.